It is really important to keep our stopwatch logic clean and simple, because currently this component is one of those components that contains the most of the logic. So let's open up this component in our editor and take a look one more time at the implementation of the stopwatch. So we have extracted pretty much all the logic from this component and moved it into a separate composable function, which is responsible for providing stopwatch functionality. And then we're supplying this function with a couple of params: initial amount of seconds that this stopwatch should display, as well as function that should be triggered anytime seconds of this stopwatch will change. But let's just take a closer look how we are calling this function inside of our composable function useStopwatch. And as we can see in here, anytime we modify value of the state variable seconds, right after we are calling that function that we have provided from outside, which is called in here handle seconds change. And the same thing is happening inside the reset function, so in here we also firstly modify value of the reactive variable seconds, and only after calling handle seconds change function. And since this is the case, there is a good opportunity for us to basically listen for changes in this reactive variable from outside, instead of manually triggering our custom function handle seconds change. So for example, what we can do is actually go back to timeline stopwatch component, and in here we are already exposing reactive state variable seconds from our composable function useStopwatch. So now we can set up a watcher to watch for changes in this variable, and then once this variable will be changed, we can trigger any logic that we need. And what we're gonna have to call anytime variable seconds will change is what's inside of this update timeline item activity seconds function. So let's just register a watcher by using function watch effect from the Vue package. This watch effect function accepts the closure, and now we're basically going to move all the logic from this function and put it inside of this closure. And the way watch effect function works is it basically watches for changes in any reactive variable that is currently used inside of this closure. And then it simply re-executes this closure once any reactive variable was changed. And in our particular case, we can see that inside of this closure, we are referencing state variable seconds. So anytime the seconds will change, the watch effect function is going to re-execute this closure. And now we just have to import this function watch effect instead of importing watch function right here. And then let's scroll down, and we no longer need this watcher. Let's remove this line, as well as the local function update timeline item activity seconds. Let's get rid of this as well. And we can even simplify the logic in here further by basically removing the second parameter that we're currently passing to useStopwatch composable function, because this function is no longer going to use this param, so it only needs to know initial amount of seconds. Let's keep only one parameter. And just like that, we can also go inside of our composable function, remove this declaration of the second parameter, as well as all mentions of this parameter. Firstly, inside this setInterval function, let's remove this call, and then we can simply put all this on one line, like so. And then let's scroll down to reset function. Here let's also remove this function call handle seconds change. And now let's go inside the timeline items module and find the function which generates randomly timeline item objects, which is this generate timeline items function. So I'm temporarily going to uncomment these two lines in order to assign random activities for the first timeline item objects, as well as assign random time for the first 5 timeline item objects. And before going to the browser, we actually have to import activities array from the activities module. So let's write down an import statement first, and then go to the browser and test this out. So let's see what randomly generated timeline objects we got. Let's only focus on those that have reading activity assigned. So as you can see, the second timeline item object has reading activity assigned, and the amount of time assigned to this object is 10 minutes. And there is also one more timeline item object, the fifth one, which has a reading activity assigned, but in this case, randomly generated time is 40 minutes. And now let's try the following. I'm going to start tracking time for the reading activity. Let's just start this stopwatch, and then we're going to remove reading activity on the activities page. And let's see what happened. As we can see, current timeline item doesn't contain selected activity reading anymore, since this activity was removed. And as for the other timeline item objects that also had reading activity assigned, we can see it was removed from those objects, but the time actually persisted. And in fact, anytime we remove a particular activity, this time should be cleared as well. So let's see why it's happening right now. And in order to understand this, firstly, we need to go inside of activity item component, where we have a button to delete activity. And as we can see, we have a listener registered on this button, which calls delete and reset activity anytime we'll delete activity. So inside this function, before actually deleting the activity, we firstly call reset timeline item activities function. Let's see what this function does. And in here, it is basically going through all timeline item objects, filters only those that have activity assigned that we are about to remove. And then it just resets a couple of properties of those timeline item objects, particularly activity ID and activity seconds. But if we're gonna take a look at the template of the timeline stopwatch component, where the time of the stopwatch is displayed, we can see that in here, we're displaying another variable, local variable seconds. But what we actually have to display here instead is the value of the activity seconds property of the timeline item object that was reset after activity was removed. And also let's just reference this property in another place, right here inside disabled attribute. So let's replace this variable seconds with reference to activity seconds property. And now let's test it out one more time. So the second timeline item has a reading activity assigned and the time is 10 in this case. The fifth object has also reading activity assigned, but the time is 40 minutes. And now I'm going to start tracking the time for the reading activity and then remove this activity on the activities page. Then switch over back to timeline page. And this time, the current timeline item activity, as we can see, was reset. And as for other objects, this time, in case of the second timeline item object, besides resetting an activity, the time of the stopwatch was also reset. And the same goes for the fifth object. So in here activity was also reset, and the time was cleared as well. But there is actually one more thing that we have to pay attention to. So one more time, let's go back to timeline items module. And right here, when we are resetting properties of timeline item objects, we're basically resetting the property of all timeline item objects, including the one which corresponds to the current timeline item. And what it's gonna cause is this one. So let's just start tracking time for coding activity. And then if I'm going to remove this activity, then let's take a look what time current timeline item shows. And now we can see that the time was reset, but in fact, we need to keep the time for the current timeline hour after activity gets deleted. So let's see how we can do this. And we're not going to do any difficult implementation. We're just going to use a ternary condition. And we're going to check if the current timeline item object corresponds to the current hour. And the value of the current hour we can get by calling current hour function, which we have defined previously. And if the current timeline item corresponds to the current hour, we're basically not going to do anything. Just reassign the same value of activity seconds property to itself. And by doing this, no changes actually will be made to activity seconds property. Otherwise, we will keep resetting this property and set the time to 0, like so. And by the way, custom function current hour was already imported in this file. So we can go back to the browser and do the same thing. So let's just start tracking time for the coding activity and then remove this activity on activities page. And now we are supposed to see that the time of the current hour should actually be persisted. And that's what is happening. We still can see 6 minutes in here. So the time for the current hour was not reset. And as for the other timeline items that had a coding activity assigned, as we can see, the time for all these objects was reset. And now everything is working as expected. So let's go back to the editor. I'm going to revert those changes I have previously made to generate timeline items function by commenting these two values and returning default values null and 0. We needed those values temporarily, only for testing. And now let's scroll up and also remove an import of this unused activities array. And now we are ready to continue development in the next lesson.